Call bank position. No limit to what you can make. Innovative employees call now. 888-555-2351. Sure, no limit what I can make at a call bank. Whatever. But I've done similar work before. Hell, I had done pretty much all work before. I was broke, not picky. So I decided to call the number. Rent was due. My electricity was 2 weeks away from getting cut off. I needed cash quickly. So I called the number and they said they were having a group interview on Saturday and it paid $20. I jumped the bus down there and wound up taking some weird psychological test. Bizarre stuff, but $20 for 2 hours sitting in a crummy strip mall, filling out a test wasn't so bad, even if I didn't get a call back. But I did. I was barely home when I got a call telling me to show up at 9 a.m. on Monday to start work, and to wear a tie. This is where it gets weird. Well, weirder. I hop off the bus the next morning, and I'm at a really nice building. I've worked at a call center before, and they're always in some cheap, crummy place where square footage is cheap. This building is gorgeous. I'm brought up to the floor and shown my individual office. Not a cubicle, an office. It's nice. And while I don't have a window, I'm definitely not complaining. I'm shown around by an office manager who explains my new job. I'm to call people and ask for some of their time. If they agree, I transfer them to one of the principals. I find the numbers I want to target. Red flags galore at this point. I don't even know what we're selling. And she makes it clear that I just have to get them to agree to give us some of their time. This makes no sense. No product, no call list provided, paid based on how well I do? Seems like a scam, right? Totally bizarre, maybe a cult. There are only a few workers and they just seem to be milling around. Then the principals arrive. Older men and women, but glamorous in an old money way. They just dripped wealth. Their clothes were expertly done. Everything looked incredible. One stopped in front of the office manager and smiled, a perfect smile. Mr. Smith, this is our new caller, Caleb. He'll be directing calls to you today. Mr. Smith nodded at me. We're very excited to have you on board, Caleb. His eyes look strange, almost reptilian. This is the first opening we've had for a while. I'm sure you'll make us all proud. After getting introduced to the phone system, I started just dialing random numbers. Finally, I got an older man who laughed when I asked if I could have 15 minutes of his time. Sure thing, son. Don't have anything else to do today. I quickly put him on hold and dialed Mr. Smith. Who am I speaking to? He asked. Ronald. Retired. He thinks we got an exciting new product. And how much of his time is he providing us? 15 minutes. Thank you, Caleb. Please put him through. 2 minutes later, Mr. Smith appeared in my office door. Good job, Caleb. First calls don't often go too well. Now try to find someone willing to give you more time. You'll get paid for how much time you can provide us. Remember, you can call anyone. That was another huge red flag. He couldn't have been on the phone more than a minute. What were we doing here? Things got weirder. I figured I would try a phone sex hotline. If I'm paying, they'd give me as much time as I wanted, right? As it turns out, they would not. I connected to Destiny, and once I asked if I could have some of her time, she got immediately weird. We told you people not to call here anymore. No, you can't. She hung up. I tried twice more on different lines and got the same response. I hadn't had much luck when one of the other callers asked if I wanted to get lunch together in the conference room. There were only 3 other callers, and I figured I could pump them for information. I tried to bring up every red flag so far, but they all shut down any questions. Mike finally leveled with me. Listen, man, I've got a high school diploma and 5 kids. I've been here 8 years and made $500,000 last year, and took plenty of vacation. Stop asking questions. This job is the best thing that'll ever happen to you. Instead of focusing on what we were doing, I asked for tips on who to call. Mike focused on stay-at-home parents. He could tell they wanted vacation. Carol liked to call empty nesters. Susan checked resume boards and asked people if she could have their time to discuss a professional opportunity. They asked what I was doing, and when I said I had tried a few phone sex hotlines, they all laughed. Those stopped working 2 years ago after they caught on to us, Mike said, though I didn't understand what he meant. After lunch, I got back to it, trying some of what everyone had suggested. I had a bit more luck, and finished up with 4 hours. At the end of the day, I was called into Mr. Smith's office and presented with a check for $250. His office was odd, full of weird books, old and foreign languages, and antiques. There was also a red digital clock on his desk, ticking backwards from what looked like just over 600,000 minutes. "A good first day, Caleb," he began. "Remember, it's not just the time you gather, it's the time you use. Today you spent 8 hours here and generated 4 hours. It's a negative day, but you'll get the hang of it." At exactly 5 o'clock, the principals, there were 10 of them, left their offices and descended into luxury cars, the doors held open by their own drivers. I went to check a cashing place and then bought a prepaid debit card so I could pay my electric bill. The next few weeks went well. I was getting the hang of it and had very few negative days. Each day I was assigned to a new principal, and they all seemed to like me. The other workers relaxed around me too, and my checks grew, soon going over 1,000 a day. I got used to the weirdiness. All of the offices were full of antiques with the exception of a digital clock each principal had on their desk, counting backwards from some giant number. I had no idea what we sold. It was a weird game to convince people to say they would give me some time, but I didn't care. I paid off my debt, I had an actual bank account that was growing for the first time in years, and I was able to upgrade my wardrobe. Then I had a big break. I had read an article about how hard the academic job market was, so hard. The next day I found a good candidate online, PhD, postdoc, and was posting his CV everywhere he possibly could. The phone was picked up on the first ring. The guy on the other end already reeked of desperation. "Hi, is this Tim? I'm calling this morning about an open professor position we have. Can I have some of your time?" "Sure thing." He was clearly nervous. "Oh, how much time do you need?" "Well," I replied, "how about the rest of your life?" I could hear the thrill in his voice through the phone. "Does this mean a tenure track position?" "Let me get you connected." I put him on hold and dialed Mr. Smith, who picked up immediately. "Grad student, thinks he's getting a tenure track position. How much time has he given us?" Mr. Smith asked. I paused. "The rest of his life." "Good job, Caleb. Put him through." At the end of the day, I was presented with a check for 100 grand. The principal said I might set a record for the highest earner. I put a down payment on a condo and moved out of my crappy apartment. When I had another big day, 2 weeks later I bought a new car so I could drive to work, and bought a spot in the expensive garage in our building. My parents visited and I took them out on an expensive dinner. For the first time in years, they didn't think I was a failure. Everything was going great. I had money, my own place, a new car. I got up the confidence to ask out a friend of mine, Amy, and we started dating. Everything was going well until I went out one night to pick us up a bottle of wine from the corner store to have with dinner. On the newspaper rack was a picture of a young man with the headline, "Grad student found dead." I picked it up and saw the name of Tim. He had been found dead in his apartment and his death was completely mysterious. I read through the article. He had died the day I called him. I called Amy and said I was feeling suddenly sick and I was going to go home. After a sleepless night and a trip to a local store, I had a plan. I arrived at work early the next day and set up a camera in the office of the principal I would be working for that day, Miss White. It was tiny and discreet, but I could monitor it from my office. When the principals arrived, I said hello to her and retreated to my office where I turned on the recorder. She was in her office with the door shut, reading some book in a language I couldn't understand. Her clock was on her desk and counting down from 754,000 minutes. I made a few calls before I got hit. A student who jumped at the idea of a 2-week all-paid vacation. I transferred him through and then turned back to the recording. Mrs. White picked up the phone and the smooth words poured from her mouth. Good morning to our big winner. I understand you're willing to give us 2 weeks of your time. This pattern repeated itself throughout the day. I couldn't figure out what was happening. At the end of the day though, suddenly I saw her moving. She picked up her phone even though I hadn't called her and started speaking. Is this Amy? Good afternoon. I'm one of Caleb's bosses. Yes, we're very fond of him too. Listen, we're planning a surprise for him and I need some of your time. Is that okay? Well, I'm not sure, but how about I take as much of your time as I need? She laughed. Perfect. Thank you. She hung up. Her clock jumped again, this time by tens of millions of minutes. She turned towards the camera and looked right into it. You shouldn't have done that, Caleb. I ran to the door of my office but found it locked from the outside. I pounded on it and then tried to call 911, but suddenly my cell phone had no service and my office phone was disconnected. I screamed and kicked the door. It was hours before I slumped, defeated against the wall. I heard the click and the door swung open to show Mr. Smith. He motioned for me to follow him into his office. When I arrived, I realized his clock, which I hadn't gotten a good look at for a few weeks, was also tens of millions of minutes higher than it had been. You're a natural, Caleb. I stared at the floor as he continued. But you pushed too hard for answers, so we had to show you what we were capable of. We had to make you understand. I glared at him. That grad student is dead. He nodded. So is your girlfriend. We had to make an example. What are you? He smiled. We've been called many things over the years. So many names, so many rumors. The truth is this. We are immortal, but we need others to freely give their time to us. In old times, this caused a rumor that we had to be invited into a house, that we could not enter freely, but those same rumors also made us seem most unsavory. I spat at him. So we're killing people? That sounds pretty unsavory to me. He sighed. Not very often. Someone will get a phone call and offer 2 weeks of their lives, an hour, a month. When they are older, they will never realize they lost that time. So we hang up and they feel a tiny bit older, though they cannot describe it. I stared at the desk while my world swirled. What do I do? He smiled. You will have a good life. You will come to work and continue to help us get time. You will be handsomely rewarded. You may stop if you like, but you will never speak of this to anyone, or there will be consequences. We need you to understand that. He paused and then took a check out of his desk for 500 grand. A bit extra since I knew there was an emotional connection for you today. I took the check as he walked past me. You can have a life people only dream of, Caleb. Your recent work has been exemplary, really pushing the envelope of what we thought was possible. I waited for a few minutes before I took the elevator to the lobby and walked out into the night. I felt nothing. It was like my soul had left my body, leaving only emptiness. My life stretched out before me and I knew how it would look. Full of money, importance, glamour, empty pleasures. I knew I would deposit the check in my pocket into my account. I knew I would be back at work in the morning. What else did I have? What else could I do? Maybe you are hoping for a job, or a vacation, or for your luck to change. Maybe you've been waiting to hear about an exciting new investment opportunity, or just lonely and want to spend some time chatting with someone. What I'm asking is, can I have some of your time?
The kids in Cold Creek. Playing in the hills around Cold Creek was a birthright. As soon as we were old enough to walk, off would go in the woods like a pack of dogs. As a direct great-granddaughter, I'd had a free run of the place since birth. The area was a silver mine in the 20s, and great-grandpa had been smart about investing his money. By the time the silver was gone, he had a nice little empire to leave to his daughters. Each of them married, built houses, and settled in Cold Creek. When their children got married and wanted families, they were given land to do the same. And when their grandchildren got married, you get the idea. This gave me 3 sets of grandparents, enough honorary actual aunts and uncles to fill a platoon, and more cousins than I knew what to do with. The land was all family, safe. Nearly. It happened one day in late September, the afternoon ambrosial, but the heat refusing to stick. When the sun felt the cold came up from the ground. I was 6. My brother, Eddie, 9, our cousin Natasha, 10, and little Gabe had just started preschool. We went out after dinner to play ghosts in the graveyard, but with 4 people, it didn't really work. Gabe wasn't willing to go anywhere without hand-holding, and after a few hours of dragging him around, while Tasha and Eddie took turns raining holy terror, we got bored and migrated to Country Road H. It was the only publicly accessible road in Cold Creek. Country H was something to do at that age. Run along the shoulder until you see headlights, then bolt into the trees to hide. When our parents had played it as kids, they called it Escaping Berlin. It was like red light, green light, except, someone could get hit by a car. Stupid is as stupid does. I honestly couldn't imagine something bad happening. Gabe's little hands had clung to my shirt as we jogged. Gonna leave you, Tasha called. Gabe started breathing fast. Don't! She ain't gonna leave, I told him. But he already gone sprinting after her as fast as his legs would carry him. Too slow, she sang and disappeared around the curve. He panicked and with all the grace of a 4-year-old, snagged his foot and toppled. He immediately started bawling. I was deeply unimpressed but went to help. Eddie darted from the woods. June, you okay? It was already dark, but Gabe's face looked fine and his legs were the only thing bloody. Just skinned his knees. Tasha worked him up. Gabe was still crying and I got my arms under his to lift him up. It's fine, stop being such a baby. Not a baby, he snuffled. You're crying like one, I said, and that finally quieted him. Eddie ruffled his hair. It's okay, buddy. Gabe sniffled a little more. I want to go home. Andy and I rolled our eyes at each other. We were big kids. Pain didn't scare us anymore. Don't be such a killjoy, Eddie muttered. Jesus. Gabe inhaled sharply and completely forgot his hurt feelings. Bang up job, Eddie. The wind came in low, and my jacket didn't stop it from knifing right through. I stuffed my hands under my arm. Suddenly, going home wasn't a bad idea. I glanced to Eddie, but he glared back. I didn't bother suggesting it. Where Eddie went, I went. I was a faithful little sister. The wind was coming strong at our backs, which is probably why we didn't hear Tasha until she was right on top of us. Run! Go! Go! Light hallowed her from a car coming on too fast, and terror grabbed me by the throat. Eddie sprinted sideways and I was a step behind, hand locked around Gabe's wrist to drag him into the woods. I barely had a foot in before the car blew past us. Robbers squealed and then we were in the woods with bellies to the ground. The car braked hard and screeched a U-turn in the road. The headlight swung over us like a searchlight. What's he doing? Eddie hissed. The engine caught, rattle shook, and kicked a low hum. It started creeping back towards us and Gabe made an awful noise. It kept on coming, hair rose along the nape of my neck. They saw me, Tasha moaned. Then they sped up. Who? I demanded. I don't know. The misery poured out of her. There were 2 of them in the windows. I don't know why. Shh. Eddie hushed and pushed at me. He urged us farther and then I was shuffling backwards with Gabe. They'll go away, Tasha whispered, and then the car was on the shoulder. It was a rusted, rattling hunk of steel. The stink of rubber and burnt oil trickled in. Scrub brush had us partly covered, and the undergrowth started fast in the woods. But right then, we were too near the tree line. It left us exposed. The car rolled to a stop and the headlights were blinding. A door swung and slammed shut. We froze. I saw him then. Big, heavy shoulders. The man just stood there blacked out by the headlights and facing the streets. My heart hammered my ribs. You know, he slurred. Can see your eyes. Like fucking deer shining all big. He took a step. You soft inside too? Gabe screamed. I reeled up to my knees, brush lashing across my face as I yanked him up. Tasha and Eddie followed our mad scramble. In seconds we were sprinting into total blackness, the trees swallowing up the sky and ground behind us. I could hear Tasha panting and Gabe crying. There was a shout, branches breaking, footfalls. I tripped again, then almost lost Gabe when he hit something in the dark and ripped from my hand. Get down, Eddie gasped, and we were scuttling into the brush. Someone yanked my hair, then my shoulder, and then dragged me under something that could have been a downed tree. Acid splashed up the back of my throat, and I wanted desperately to vomit. Purge. Get it out. Get it out. Quiet, my brother said. I curled over Gabe, and when he wouldn't shush, I gagged him with my sleeve. He bit into my arm, but adrenaline had me shaking so badly I didn't feel it. Tasha wrapped around my side, and then Eddie crawled over us. Sheer terror blotted out all higher brain function. 1 minute passed. 2. A third, and I thought that I'd just maybe. A dim light hit a tree 50 feet out. Someone in our pile made a gutted sound. The slurred voice came back. The fuck took you so long? Gotta come prepared, a new voice said. It was higher, wet in the back of his throat. See him? Can't have gone yet, said the big man. And then the light bounced away until the dark swallowed it. We were blind again. The wind kicked up, shaking the branches like old bones. Tasha pitched her voice under it. We gotta go, please. Eddie's breath washed against my neck. We can't see out here. We gotta get to a road. But, I whimpered. Eddie pressed, we gotta. I believed him. We army crawled from the light and angled for the nearest private road that came off County H. Gabe was dead weight. Come on, I choked down a sob. Gabe, please. He shuddered and a low warbling sound spilled from him when I unstuck my sleeve. Gabe, I hissed and he still didn't move. Tasha slithered back to us and shook him. If you don't move right now, they'll find us and hurt you. Get up. The thought hadn't occurred me. My hindbrain had ignited and not thought any farther beyond running. Now it was there, clamoring inside me. They'll hurt you, they'll hurt you, they'll hurt you. Gabe started crawling. Time hemorrhaged. I don't know how long it lasted. The creeping, the dirt, the briar snagging skin. Eventually, I started seeing branches. There was no moon and their starlight was dim, but it was enough to lead us onto a switchback lane. Which way? Tasha asked. Eddie swung left, then right, then left again. Her voice cracked. Which way? A low rumble came up the road, a rattle-shake shriek. Someone screamed and sent us bolting. Eddie hacked the tree line running to I didn't know where. I followed. There had to be houses soon. Houses started less than half a mile from County H, so they had to be. Headlights burned in. Left, screeched Tasha, and we swerved into the woods. I got 8 steps in when the grunt went out. I hit water, and it smashed through my nose in a float down my throat. We'd run smack dab into a creek. The water was deep and so damn cold it felt like being skinned. My feet weren't touching ground and I'd lost Gabe. The water was over my head. I bridged the surface and wheezed. The water burned worse coming back out. Help! I could barely mouth the word. Help! Something sloshed and the trees were getting brighter. For a moment, I didn't remember why that was a bad thing. A hand grabbed the back of my jacket and dragged. June! Eddie sputtered and tried to say something but started hacking too. Despite that, he kept pulling us backwards until my feet hit silt. I saw two pale blobs, blinked the water out of my eyes, then realized it was Tasha grabbing Gabe to her far bank. She didn't get there. The first headlight gouged in and we dropped, sinking our heads behind the roots peeled off the bank. The car rolled by so close I could see the driver, his arm hanging loose and skinny out the window. It had a deer shiner on the side of the car lit like a flare. Just before it touched water, I shut my eyes and went back under. I lost sound. My fingertips started going numb. My lungs burnt and then heaved. I barely managed 20 seconds before I had to slam back up. When my throat cleared, the red haze of taillights was fading. I tried to climb the bank. Eddie grabbed me. Wait, my teeth clattered. Why? I know where we are. His breath spilled in a brittle white cloud. This road is a dead end. We gotta wait or they'll see us when they swing back. I'm cold. The muscles in my chest were constricting so tightly I thought my lungs would pop. I'm sorry. He pulled me down. But once they go back past, Uncle Dan's house is at the end of the road, okay? Everything in my joints was starting to lock. It felt like if I moved, my bones would grind up like chalk. I heard Tasha whisper, Gabe's lips are turning blue. I moved. We piled in close and wrapped around Gabe like animals. His eyelids were fluttering, but his teeth weren't chattering. Something about it was very, very wrong. I heard the engine again. A moan worked between my teeth. One more time, Eddie promised. Someone was whistling and it wasn't us. The deer shiner was on the opposite side now, but I could see the big man and his arms slung out the window. Something sparkled in his fist. And I saw a knife, a gutting knife. Terra hit like lightning. It throbbed tighter and tighter until it was bolt tearing through me. Someone's hand hit the top of my head and pushed. I went under. This time we didn't even last 10 seconds before we breached. I saw the taillight casing as they crawled out of sight. Go back, my brother said, and I'm not sure where any of us found the strength to swim to the other bank, let alone climb it, but we did. Adrenaline's a hell of a thing. We left the woods to limp up the road. My ears kept straining for the car to come back and smash on our backs. Only thing rattling out there were the trees. My skin needled and slowly went numb. My hair was spilling water down my back like the drag of a knife. I'd never been this cold. I nearly screamed when the road started getting bright again, and it took me a panicked few seconds to realize the light was coming from a house. Tasha sobbed and so did Eddie. Gabe didn't make any noise at all. I found enough energy to run and start banging on the back door. It all got a little blurry after that. Mary, Dan's wife, came to the door. She took one look at us and screamed for him, then immediately rushed Gabe upstairs. Uncle Dan hauled us inside and started asking questions. And Tasha was saying car. It was a car. They saw me. I'm sorry. And Eddie was repeating, they chased us. They were gonna hurt us. They chased us. And I was repeating the word knife. Uncle Dan locked the doors and dropped the lights on the ground floor. He got on the phone and said something sharp I couldn't hear over the sloshing in my skull. Time blinked. I was in a bathroom. I was naked in a bathroom being towel dried to within an inch of my life. Big hands buttoned me into a flannel, then swaddled me in blankets like a baby. Aunt Gemma showed up, I don't know when, but she stuck a hot water bottle in my cocoon and then put me in a bed with Eddie. Tasha got tucked in my other side, and then Aunt Marie was reading to us and promising that everything will be okay. Somewhere downstairs, I heard a lot of angry voices. I drifted off. When I woke again, the room was dark and I was sweating through the sheets. Everything felt slippery, feverish, and charred to slurry. A rattle-shake shriek went the engine out the window. No. I jackknifed off the mattress and clawed to the glass. It was the car. I was going to scream, would have screamed if my mouth wasn't a skein of dry wool. The engine cut and headlights went dark. A broad man stepped out and my head swam and nearly overflowed. He kicked back on the hood, pulled off his gloves, then put a cigarette in his mouth and lit it. The glow washed across his face and it was Luke. My cousin Luke. Luke who didn't talk, slurred, or high wet in the back of his throat. I didn't understand. And that's what sent me downstairs. It seemed like anger at the time, but I'm pretty sure now that it was fever. I dragged the quilt twid and the bottom of the house was dark. The lock turned easily and then I was outside. Luke's head swung. Junebug? Darling, why are you out of bed? I hiccuped. Why is it here? Why? He looked to the car. Oh, Junebug, come here. He stuck the cigarette between his lips and spread his arms. There was no hesitation. I ran to him and he swept me up. He cradled me into his left arm and cupped my head. Another drag on the cigarette lit his face. He looked jagged. Sweat shined on his forehead and his hair was still a mess coming out of his buzz cut. With my face crooked in his shoulder, all I could smell was ash and metal. Why is it here? The cutlass? His eyes flicked off my face. He got a hand up, took out his cigarette, and held it behind my head. Listen, baby, what happened tonight was a mean prank. Some of the boys were messing with you. You weren't gonna get hurt. The people in the car had been family? Something in me crumpled. Why'd they do that? He took another sharp drag, turned a little to let the smoke spill from his mouth. People are bastards sometimes. Sorry. People are bad sometimes. They don't think and do something mean, alright? But you don't have to worry. It was scary. He dropped the cigarette and there was no light in his eyes. I know. Grandpa Jim is going to get here soon and he'll make them real sorry. I nodded seriously. Grandpa Jim makes everyone sorry. That he does. He tucked me closer. Just forget about this. Everything's gonna be right as rain come morning. Okay. My eyelids were heavier. At the moment I was warm and nowhere else was safer. And then he gazed down at me with painful intensity. I'm never going to let anyone hurt you, understand? My eyes slipped shut. A little while later another engine sounded. That's Grandpa Jim. Luke shook me awake. Go on, get back in. He'll be angry if he sees you. I lived in holy terror of Grandpa Jim and his severe looks for years. I didn't need telling. Luke put me down and I scurried back inside. I turned at the door just as the headlights of Grandpa Jim's truck swashed on the cutlass onto Luke. Onto his battered hands, knuckles bruised to black. I shut the door. Sometime in the night, I heard that rattleshake shriek start again and fade off into the night. The cutlass was gone come daylight. No one ever talked about it again. The next morning we had a burning day all over at Cold Creek, a bit of a treat for all of the fuss. I got to throw branches and leaves and old boots into the fire while our parents doted on me and Eddie. I saw Gabe bundled by one of the fires behind Grandma Lillian's place. He looked too pale, but he chattered up a storm before his mom whisked him inside for hot cider. Life went on. We got older and did crazier things to one another. We drank and set things on fire and ran through the woods at night. Gabe seemingly forgot it happened. Every once in a while, Eddie or Tasha will bring it up just to point out, hey, remember the time we thought hiding in a creek in 50-degree conditions was a good idea? Nothing of it ever set right, and I started looking at my older cousins to try and find it in their eyes. Most of them were old enough to have kids the same age as us when it happened. I wondered if they regretted it now, looking in their children's faces. I wondered if they even remembered it. The whole thing colored how I saw my family for years. Then came another day in September. I was off work and in my grandma's kitchen, warm and stuffed with breakfast scraps. Grandpa Frank handed me the newspaper. Sweetheart, you have the prettiest voice of all my girls. Why don't you read to us? His eyes hadn't been up to the task in a long while, so I read. It was the nearest town's local gazette. The governor doing this, the sheriff doing that, a local apparatus. New zoning ordinances. Look at this bear someone shot, oh my. What's the world coming to, my grandma said. You can't even build your own house without someone butting in. Grandpa patted her hand while Grandma insisted none of those awful ordinances would be coming to Cold Creek. No, sir. I didn't pay much mind. My eyes had been drawn across the page to a picture. Two men, ages 20 and 22, best friends according to the caption. Hell raises here and there, but not a bad sort. It was the 15-year anniversary of their disappearance. It'd been a real bungle of a case. They'd been adults when they went missing, and the sheriff hadn't taken the family seriously until they'd been gone for 2 weeks. By the time people started looking, the boys were nowhere to be found. No leads had ever surfaced. The family of the older boy were pleading that if anyone knew anything to please call his hotline number. We're still looking for him. We haven't given up. He's our boy. Local law enforcement was sure they were dead, or in Mexico, either or. I skimmed down and at the very end it said, both were last seen in a 1976 Cutlass Supreme. The body of the car was noted to be heavily rusted. If you have any information on this person's or vehicle, please place a call to... Well, would you look at that? Something interesting, sweetheart? I dropped the paper and my entire world dropped with it. That night I'd been holding on so long, swelled with horror until it strangled me. It'd never been family. It'd never been a prank. Black woods and black water and the hook of a waiting knife. Jesus fucking Christ. I paused until my hands steadied. I picked up the paper. No, Grandpa, and dimpled at him. Nothing to write home about. It occurred to me I needed to go be sweet on Grandpa Jim. That I needed to hug Uncle Dan. That I needed to kiss Luke hello. He brushed back my hair. You sure? I turned the page. Very. He didn't ask twice and I didn't breathe a word. I was Cold Creek born and raised, a direct great-granddaughter. Someone had been watching my back since the moment I was born. As soon as we were old enough to understand, off would go in the woods like a pack of dogs. And after all these years I finally understood. Playing in the hills around Cold Creek was a birthright, and so was burying our nightmares in them. So, my wife is a qualified nursery nurse. Because she's good at her job, she's on good terms with most of the parents of the children in her room, and from time to time, some of the parents would ask her to babysit for them on the side, knowing that their children already feel comfortable with her and that because of her job, she's the perfect candidate for looking after children privately in their homes. One day, the parents of one of the quieter children asked her to babysit for them whilst they're at a function. Now, they lived quite far away, a lot further than she's normally prepared to go, but like most things in life, the money was good, so she didn't think twice. She asked me to drive her there and pick her up as the house is on the middle of Dartmoor and she wasn't confident driving through country lanes. Now, when I say it was on the middle of the moors, I mean there wasn't a house for miles. It's the type of place where if you spend too long outside at night, even the wind howling will sound like someone whispering to you out from the darkness. As a good husband that I am, I drive her to this house. We get there after a 30-minute drive to find this old, worn-down cottage, draped in darkness and aesthetically exactly how you'd imagine a stereotypical farmhouse to look. Outhouses, barns, and a thatched-roofed cottage complete with chicken coops and various old farming equipment that I can only imagine has laid dormant on the grounds for many, many years. Almost like a shrine to a forgotten time when engines and automatic equipment were a new invention and farmers still relied on hard work and tools that had been passed down for generations, having never failed before. She gets out of the car and I kiss her goodbye and she's enveloped into the darkness as she walks towards the front door. My headlights illuminating the house in the type of way that makes it look like it's menacingly staring at you. Now, signal is non-existent on the moors. Even in this day and age, being able to make a phone call on your mobile or even text is a luxury limited to the outskirts closer to the main towns. I didn't hear from her until I picked her up later that night. When I saw the front door open, she bolted and ran to the car, not once looking back. I thought she was excited to see me, but when I saw her face, it was pale and she'd obviously been crying. She told me to drive, and for 10 minutes we sat in silence. An awkward, unnerving silence. After she composed herself, she told me what had happened. The night had started like any other. After she'd arrived, the parents greeted her and gave a quick tour of the house. The boy she was babysitting was already ready for bed, and the parents left for their function. After watching some cartoons, she ushered the boy upstairs to bed and read him a story. The boy was around 4 or 5, I can't quite remember. About an hour later, she heard movement upstairs. Thinking nothing of it, she continued reading her book, but the noise became louder to the point where she went upstairs and found the boy hiding under his bed. She scolded the boy for being out of bed when he should be sleeping, but the boy seemed frightened and was adamant that there were monsters in the house. My wife told him that monsters aren't real and put him back to bed. She went back downstairs and another hour passed when she heard noises coming from upstairs again, louder and different from before. Before she had a chance to get up, she heard a boy scream, so she raced upstairs to the boy's room, but he wasn't there. She reached upstairs for him and eventually found him cowering in fear in the bathroom. He'd hidden in a wicker laundry basket, the type with a lid that you could still see through. The boy was scared beyond belief, she later told me on the drive home. She'd comforted him for a little while and seemed confident that he was fine after explaining that scratching noises were probably mice in between the floorboards and there was nothing to be frightened of. Ghosts and monsters aren't real, and that there's definitely nothing in the house you should be afraid of. By now, she was starting to get a little scared herself. She was on the middle of the moors, in a house she wasn't familiar with, and although the boy had believed her explanation of a family of mice living under the floorboards, she was starting to doubt herself, and her thoughts turned to the thinking that there was something else in the house. She'd been reading her book for about an hour when the old grandfather clock in the entrance hall started chiming midnight. She'd sat listening to it, all the while surveying her old unfamiliar surroundings. Old houses always have a spooky feel to them, but whilst the clock was chiming, it was almost as if the house was changing, becoming something sinister, she'd said. When the clock chimed the final tone to signify midnight, all the lights in the house went out, and even to this day she swears blind that she heard something growl in the darkness. Now, the parents had advised that because the house was old, they'd experienced power cuts all the time, and they explained how to reset the electric box to bring everything back. But before she had a chance to investigate, she heard another scream from upstairs. She raced upstairs, which proved difficult in the complete darkness, and entered the boy's room. He was hiding under his covers, but even in the darkness, she could make out his shape under the duvet. The boy was visibly shaking as my wife could see the covers fidget. After telling him that everything was alright and that the power had just gone, he muttered, "There's monsters." Losing sight of fear and becoming a little bit short with him, she reiterated for the third time that there are no monsters, and to prove it, she'd look around in his room, in the jovial, obvious way that someone would search for monsters to prove that there are none to a child. She looked under his bed. "No monsters here," she said. She checked his windows to make sure they were locked and secure. "No monsters getting in here," she confirmed. Finally, she walked to his wardrobe. It was one of those wardrobes that was built into the room and was very deep. Opened the door and poked around, and sure enough, there's no monsters in here either. She was about to close the door when she heard heavy breathing from the back of the wardrobe. She slowly drew back the clothes on the rail and peered into the back of the wardrobe, and there, hugging his knees and rocking backwards and forwards, was the boy. "There's a monster in my bed," he said without looking up, too scared to even acknowledge my wife's presence. My wife turned her head slowly, and the bundle that she'd assumed was the boy in bed was still there, under the covers, but it had set up, and her eyes having adjusted slightly to the darkness, she could see through the thin cover that whatever it was looking at her. She grabbed the boy and ran downstairs to the living room. The only source of light in the house was the fire that the parents had set before leaving. For an entire hour, she and the boy hid under a blanket in the living room. All the while, the noises she'd heard earlier continued upstairs. Scratching, pacing, and a gravely moaning. The type of noises something makes when it's looking for something unsuccessfully. Finally, after what she described as an eternity, but in hindsight couldn't have been long, the parents showed up. They duly paid her, something she now considers not worth the experience, and they asked if she was available for another night. She politely declined. It wasn't until a few weeks later that she told the parents what had happened when they'd come to pick up the boy from nursery. They weren't surprised. She had been the fifth babysitter in as many months that wouldn't come back. They said they'd experienced things all the time, but never to that extent. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why my wife no longer babysits privately. An old man's last secret. My grandfather is 95 years old and not long for this world. There's nothing but a mess of tubes and wires to tether him here with us. It's difficult for him to speak, but each rasping whisper carries a severe weight that cannot be interrupted. My family doesn't talk about things like that, though, so whenever I visit with my dad, we tend to spend most of the time sitting in near silence. "What a newsweek, huh?" my dad might say. Grandfather will grunt. "Crazy world." Then, silence again. Small talk seems almost disrespectful to the gravity of the situation, but no one wants to be the first to broach the irrevocable goodbye. When the silence gets too loud, my dad will start to fidget with his phone or pull out a book until one of us makes an excuse to leave. That's how it went yesterday, with my father mumbling something about a dentist appointment and hurrying out the door almost as soon as we arrived. "You'll stay though, won't you?" my grandfather said when we were alone in the room. "You listened to an old man's last secret." This was it then. The end of the road was in sight. "Would you like me to call Dad back?" I asked. Grandfather shook his head as far as the oxygen tubes would allow to turn. I'd rather he didn't know. I already knew some of the story he told me. It began when my grandfather was 20 years old living in Nazi Germany. He'd been working forced labor on a farm, but managed to smuggle my grandmother and infant father out of the country hidden in a grain shipment. He'd been caught almost immediately and sent to the concentration camp at Buchenwald, where he endured the next 2 years until he was liberated by Allied forces. You don't have to tell me what happened there if you don't want to, I told him. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the gruesome details. He was unusually animated and persistent though, promising it was something that needed to be said. He wouldn't have survived the ordeal if it hadn't been for a friend he'd met there. One of the Nazi officers, a Rottenführer squad leader, had taken a special interest in him because of their striking similarity in age and appearance. The two would sit on either side of the barbed wire fence and swap stories about their childhoods. My grandfather would talk about my grandmother, how beautiful she was, and how he wouldn't give up until he found her again. The SS officer had gone straight from the Hitlerjugend to the army and had never been intimate with a woman. He became enraptured in my grandfather's tales of romance, and the two became close friends despite the circumstances. The officer twice spared my grandfather's name from work assignments that meant certain death, and it often slipped extra rations through the fence, which my grandfather would then distribute to other prisoners. It wasn't a good life, but it was life, and that was good, grandfather said. Things changed as the war began drawing to a close. The Nazi officers became increasingly paranoid and desperate as the Allied forces moved in. It became common practice for lower-ranking officers to be held as scapegoats when impossible work orders were not met. Besides that, the rumor that the Rottenführer was protecting my grandfather put him in a dire position with his own officers. Faced between protecting my grandfather and his own hide, the Rottenführer signed the order for my grandfather to be sent to a nearby armaments factory. 18-hour workdays, starvation rations, no medical attention. The factory might as well have been a death sentence. The 3-month survival rate was less than 50%. In the name of love, my grandfather pleaded, let him survive to find her again. She was waiting for him in America. The Rottenführer was moved, but his decision was final. His only compromise was to record the address of where she went and send her a letter to let her know what happened to him. So, how did you survive? I asked. Did he change his mind? Were you rescued from the factory? Shielded from the worst of the camp by the Rottenführer, the transition to the factory proved too difficult for a young farmer. He did not last the first week. What do you mean didn't last? How'd you get out? The exertion of the long story was taking its toll on my grandfather. He coughed and wheezed, struggling to draw breath for several seconds before clearing his throat a final time. On April 11, 1945, the Buchenwald camp was liberated. Many of the Nazis had already abandoned their position and fled into the country. Others decided to lock themselves inside, pretending to be prisoners themselves, so the Allied forces would have mercy on them. This was especially convincing for those who had taken the time to get to know the prisoners and could assume their identities. When the SS officer gave the information and address of his lost love, he was allowed to board the next transport ship returning to America to be reunited with her. The gears in my head were turning, and then stopped. Your grandmother was suspicious at first when I met her, but she accepted that the war had changed me. Besides, I knew so many stories about her that she couldn't deny our shared history. I raised his boy as my own, and lived the life he dreamed of every night until his death. Do you think your real grandfather would forgive me if he knew? I didn't have an answer for him then, and I didn't get another chance. He died in his sleep that night after a long and happy life that was not his.
As all of you know, there's a cool game called Fortnite. It's a battle royale game with a bit of building aspect to it. You can play a match solo with one teammate or three, and if you're alone, you get matched with randoms who don't talk most of the time. While I was playing 4-player squad, and game after game, I was matched with idiots who don't know how to play. So finally, the next game, of course, I was happy when I matched with someone who had a mic. He was pretty damn good too. We won the match and I asked him if he wanted to queue up together, and he agreed. Match after match, we continued to win. I seemed to have lost track of time because when I checked my phone, it was 2 a.m. I told him I was gonna head off to bed, but he convinced me to play just one more match, and I agreed. This time we decided to do a 4-player match rather than duos. Our two teammates both had mics. One of them seemed okay, but the other, it sounded like his mic was messed up or something. When he talked, it was hard to describe. A crackling noise is what I would describe it as. It was weird. We started the match and he began asking us bizarre questions, and guessed our responses before we even answered. Every guess was correct. I changed the real locations and names for privacy purposes. What state are you in? Vermont, he would answer before we even got a chance to respond. Then he began asking the fourth guy disturbing shit. How's your mom Vanessa doing? Have you checked on her to make sure she's okay? It got to the point where the guy was getting agitated. Me and my friend were also getting annoyed at the ear-piercing mic of this creep. We decided to try to leave. I opened the menu, and no matter how many times I clicked exit, nothing happened. I tried turning my PS4 off and my TV too, and nothing worked. I then asked why his dog was barking, then a few seconds later the kid's dog started to bark. I heard him say "what the fuck" before I heard a crash and a scream before he disconnected from the match. Then he began asking the guy I played with earlier similar questions. I messaged him privately telling him to try to stall since we almost won the match and there were just 10 players left. He couldn't hold out long enough before I heard a thud on his line, then saw he disconnected. 3 players left. He began to go for me. Nice apartment. It would be a shame if there were bloodstains on the wall. You might want to double check, make sure your door is locked. Then I had the feeling I was being watched and something was creeping up on me. Then I saw the last player. I shot at him like there was no tomorrow. Then the winner crap came up and I quickly disconnected the match and turned off my PS4 and closed my eyes, waiting my fate. But the seconds turned to minutes and the minutes turned to hours. Nothing happened. I checked my friend's PS account from earlier and messaged him asking if he was okay. The only response I got was this. If anyone knows what this says, please let me know. And if you ever join a match and some guy has a crackling mic, leave before it starts. Almost no one from my childhood lives in this town anymore. Trust me, I don't want to be here, but I think it's the only way. The world needs to know he exists. It all started about 6 years back. A young girl went missing, last seen walking from the local high school. Before that, everything was different. God, the people around here wouldn't even lock their doors at night. It really was an ideal country town. Back then, a jewel hidden just beyond the border of the city. But that all changed. If you're from around here, you know the story, or at least some version of it. He's basically an urban legend now, but I know the truth. Teenagers from the next town over tell his story on Halloween or over campfires like he's some kind of myth. The story starts with a teenage girl gone missing, then another. Pretty soon our whole rural town is abuzz with accusations, rumors, and helpless, hysterical parents. But no one gets caught. The story goes that a father of one of the girls had enough. The police were too disorganized or too stupid to catch the kidnapper. so he took matters into his own hands. Over the course of a week, he retraced his daughter's steps across town dozens of times. He hired a small army of private investigators and finally figured out where the kidnapper had taken her. Rather than alert the cops with the overwhelming evidence he had, the father tracked the guy down himself, and to his horror, he found out that it was a local priest. When the dad arrived, he discovered the awful facts. His daughter and several other young girls were viciously raped and mutilated beyond recognition. Gashes and wounds covered almost every area of their flesh, each with a long cut from behind the ear, all the way down to their throats. All 3 girls were dead. In an act of primal rage, the father beat the priest half to death, but it wasn't over. That would have been too good for him. The father, a well-known butcher, would often carve up wild game for local hunters with those same hands. He tied up the sick son of a bitch and he skinned him alive. He filleted the priest with the same knives used on his daughter, and then he left him. What he didn't know, however, was that despite the shrieking screams of agony and the ungodly amount of blood loss, the priest was still alive. Somehow, it's beyond comprehension, but somehow he got off that table he was tied to and he slipped away into the shadows. Days later, the father confessed to local authorities about what he'd done, and that's when they realized the body was gone. Too bad that wasn't enough to keep his wife from leaving him. She believed him wholeheartedly and couldn't bring herself to live with someone as gruesome as the psychopath who'd murdered their daughter. A few days before she left town, another body was found. Her husband, hanging in a tree in the local park, with the skin of his face peeled off by what appeared to be a razor blade, both of his eyes gouged out. Another investigation and no arrest. The trial had gone cold. It seemed like whoever hung him there left no fingerprints, no footprints even, and no trace that another person had done this, like it was done by some kind of spirit. In the end, the head detective on the case explained that the father must have done it to himself. For a man grieving over the loss of his child, a bit of insanity made sense, especially considering his erratic behavior and leading the cops to an empty warehouse full of animal blood. Just after the funeral, 2 more local girls went missing. Then, a few more, each of them slowly reappearing, each with their faces sliced off, the flesh of their bodies torn up, all found hanging from trees in the woods. The police couldn't make sense of it. By the time the feds got involved, about half the families in town moved out. At some point, all the death, horror, and gore suddenly stopped. No more murders, no more ghastly tales of skinned bodies hanging from trees. No chase for a serial killer wanted for horrific slayings. That was it. It was as if someone had flipped a switch. Eventually, the out-of-town real estate developers took the many abandoned homes as an opportunity to redevelop. And thanks to that, the area quickly became pretty popular with college kids from the city. People say it's safe now, but others are certain the skinless man is still out there, watching, searching for his next victim. That's usually where the story ends, and someone around the campfire screams a bloody, curdling cry to scare the pants off other partygoers. Those stupid fucks. They don't know how real this is. They don't understand that they're all in danger. I'm going to prove it. I need to prove it before he comes back.